Hey guys, thank you so much for popping in again. This is episode 7 of our series, The Human Condition. If you haven't seen the first 6 episodes, I would advise you to go back and watch those because we are exploring a lot of concepts and the episodes sort of build on each other. So without further ado, I'm going to jump right back in and see where we left off last time. Last time we looked into the concept of self, of ego consciousness, of emergence, and how those might relate. And if we go back to our very basic drawing that you probably know very well by now, if we have time down here, this is t0, t plus 1, t minus 1, past, present, future. We opened up a space that we called four-dimensional. That's in these boundaries right here, and 4 dimensions, of course, is the 3 spatial dimensions plus time. We talked about there probably being many more dimensions that are outside of time space, which is really hard to fathom, but we sort of drew them up here. So that will be 5D plus. Not sure how many there are, but science postulates anywhere between 11 to, I think, 20. I tend to forget. And now, if we want to situate the human being, we characterized the human being, or we sort of, in order to make things more easy to talk about, we focused in on the brain, and so I'm going to just draw a very simple brain right here. Now, we said that the brain, according to latest scientific views, is both part of this four-dimensional and therefore part of this Newtonian sort of physics world of macro objects, of gravity, of masses, of just the sort of the world that we usually experience, right? But then there's also this level of quantum physics, which opened up a whole new way of looking at things, and that is that when you go down to the very smallest particles of matter, then those become wave functions. I mean, they have a dual nature, it seems. They are wave functions, they are like overlapping waves until there's a consciousness observing, and with a consciousness observing, the observation collapses the wave function and turns a wave into which we would call Newtonian particle. Now, so there's this view, there's a lot of views obviously out there, and I personally subscribe to the idea of monistic idealism, purported by a physics professor named Amit Goswami. He wrote a lot of books on the subject, and he started a whole movement. You might want to Google him. I'll actually link his one of his books in the comment section for you to check out. It's quite a good summary of everything we've been talking about here. And so Goswami's position is that the human brain both has a place in the Newtonian physics world, but it also has a place in the quantum physics world, and he postulates that consciousness actually is the ground of all being, and out of consciousness arises pretty much everything we can experience, so even matter. I mean, it's not only him. There's a lot of other findings in science, especially in neuroscience, that suggest similar, that sort of supports this view. So that means, or that would render a human being a somewhat or a somewhat stable macro object in terms of, you know, taking part in the Newtonian world of 4 dimensions, but then we would probably suppose that the brain is also capable of, or is also part of this quantum world, in which other laws apply than in the Newtonian physics world, and that somehow the human being is able to move in all these worlds, so to speak. So if we take this further, then we could say human beings are multidimensional beings, and I would probably, to make this, to sort of make this more clear, I would probably draw, today I would probably draw a human being in terms of net of coordinates, probably, because it also implies, you know, the possibility for a human being to access all these other dimensions, which I find completely fascinating. And now there's a lot of questions, of course, that come up, you know, from starting with, well, what is the I? What is the self? Is there a God? And all that kind of stuff. So there's a ton of questions that open up when you think about these things. We can only get to so many at a time. I think that today it would make sense to talk about causation, just to introduce the concept of causation, because that also is something that's being debated, you know, back and forth, depending on what sort of view you hold. So I said that Amit Goswami's view is the view of Monistic Idealism, which basically says consciousness is primary and everything else is secondary, right? Even matter. Okay. What used to be what still is, or I mean, there's debate about what's the pervasive view today, but what still is very pervasive in all science is that that matter is primary, and somehow consciousness or the mind arises is an epiphenomenon of the brain, right? That's sort of like the other crass position one could have. I think, if as a non-scientist, personally, in my experience, I experience it in another way. I do tend to experience energy as much as I can experience matter, you know, and therefore I've always been looking for ways to explain to myself what my experiences are and where they come from, and how to sort of navigate in a world that seems to be more dimensional than the 4 dimensions that everybody seems to be living in. and happy about. And so that's what really led me down this path of just decades of trying to figure out, wrapping my head around scientific and all kinds of other concepts to find a way to understand and to sort of situate the experience I'm having. And so if in this very simple sort of kitchen physics approach, if you will, my understanding would be that it makes absolute sense that when we say that consciousness is primary, that and if we take that image of this, I mean, I think this is a very old image that has been tradited over thousands of years, is that you can regard consciousness as a huge sea, if you will, and the waves that come and go are the phenomena that, and they include us as beings. So we could be looked at as wave that is stable for a certain amount of time, but then also recedes back into this ocean. And of course, when we think about being, when we think in terms of ego consciousness, if that's what we identify with predominantly, then that's a view that's very scary and threatening to us, because we think, well, but I'm an individual, so how can I be having individual experiences and just be a wave in the ocean at the same time? That somehow doesn't match, doesn't make sense. So I think that's where a lot of the reluctancy comes from, of really embracing this monistic idealist theory, even though if you really delve into that, you will find that that this view actually solves a lot of problems that quantum physics pose, and that's sort of like the only way to marry quantum physics with Newtonian physics. So back to causation. We usually think of causation, I mean, we actually started talking about causation already without you noticing probably, but usually we think of causation as, inside of this four-dimensional space, if you have one object and the object A, and object A does something to object B, then something C happens. So A causes B to do C, or to change. A can cause B to change its state or status, and that has some kind of effect. Now, if we introduce more dimensions than just 4 dimensions, and especially if we introduce dimensions that we propose are out of space-time, then that becomes much more, then talking about causation becomes much more difficult, because in our understanding, causation requires physicality, requires exact position, requires time, requires all these kind of things in order to work. But Amit Goswami introduced a new concept, or an additional concept. He said, okay, well, of course there's this type of causality, but then there might also be another type of causality, and he called it upward causality and downward causality. And upward causality, you can imagine, is actually sort of like I mean, if you could take this concept of upward causality and explain how something that is something that is physical, but I think limited, and local could influence something else that is also physical and local. And downward causality, I mean, this is simplified, very much simplified. So you want to really make sure and go back to the source and actually Google all these things that we're talking about here, because there's no way I can, get across these complicated concepts in 20 minutes or so. Not being a scientist, but still I'm trying. So, and up and downward causality is mostly interesting and necessary if you try to explain, well, how could a quantum level have an effect on a non-quantum level, meaning on a Newtonian or macro level, and vice versa. And especially if we equate the quantum world or these waves of possibility waves, they're called in quantum physics, with consciousness as just primary, or just a very primary property of everything, really, then you're sooner or later you have the problem, well, how do you explain, how does consciousness have a causal effect on matter and vice versa? And that's why that's where the concepts of upward and downward causation come into play. And to make this super simple, downward causation implies that something elusive as consciousness or a wave function could actually influence or bring about matter, and upward causation means that something solid as matter could actually influence or cause an effect in something very elusive, such as consciousness or the wave function. So basically, all of this is trying to, again, argue that a piercing through of a human being to other dimensions than just the four that we primarily experience is possible. And that it is in fact the brain that is able to handle or translate quantum effects into physicality. And of course, in a brain that would mean, synaptical reactions, chemical reactions, and I find that not only fascinating, but it makes me hopeful that we will at some point be able to bring together what we hitherto thought of as spirituality, and or even worse in quote unquote religions, and that which we think of as the real world and the objective world and the scientific world, And I think what's happening right now, I said that before in the video before, is that these very two big areas are starting to come together in terms. I mean, they've always been very similar, but nobody really took the time, or was given the chance to really explore those in a scientific matter, and I think that's happening more and more. And I think I'm going to leave you with that, because that's a lot to research and Google and wrap your head around. So let's summarize real quick. So we said that the human brain is actually capable. It's possible because Newtonian physics talks also about classical. It is also called classic. So the brain is both an object. I mean, in terms it's matter. You could regard it as machine. That's sort of processing things, and that neuroscience can explain pretty much everything and say, okay, well, it's possible that thoughts or mind or whatever is an epiphenomenon of whatever happens mechanically in the brain. But then now we have another perspective and we say that both of them are possible. So the brain is both part of this very classical and Newtonian world. Yes, and there is this mechanical aspect, but then there's also this other aspect, and it's also part of the quantum world, and it can actually interpret by way of downward causation, interpret signals is a difficult word in that regard, but interpret input maybe, or is just connected, let's say, to other dimensions. That's probably better to say that. Yeah. Right. Let me just think for a second. So to hark back to sort of the spiritual side of things, if you will, we talked forever about the human brain when it perceives, when it's in this mode of perceiving and processing information, and creating and storing memory and all that, and being formed and being, for lack of a better term, programmed already. Also, because the brain does function on one side much like a computer. It can be programmed. The more you, with repetition of sensory input, those neural pathways get stronger and stronger and stronger, and then it sort of becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy with time, good or bad, But as a side product, we said that the brain also creates the notion of there being an ego consciousness, or I. And what's really important is the problem with that is that the brain starts to think that this is the observer, and that this observer is separated from all the other observers, right? Which in the mind of Amit Goswami is a mistake, and I can subscribe to that as well. I believe that's exactly what's happening. And that's probably why I'm doing all these videos, is that I think we need to become aware of that problem, and we need to become aware of our being very much identified with ego consciousness, of the possibility to be very much identified with ego consciousness, because, as we now learned, there's this whole other side that's accessible to the human brain, and that would be what we called all consciousness, which means in fact that there is no separation, and that by way of the quantum level, if you want, all brains are connected, and it's in fact the same consciousness that is active in each and every brain, and that the illusion of being separate, and having this ego consciousness is merely a result of having a unique brain structure, of having had unique experiences in the past that formed your primary neural pathways and the way you react, machine-like react, so to speak, to new situations based on what you've learned in the past. So there is this aspect of the human being. It's almost like it's a dual mechanism, you know. So you have the possibility to have experiences, and the great danger is that you start identifying solely with this ego consciousness, which brings about the thought of separateness, duality, division, and later on, necessarily somewhere down the line, conflict. And I feel, to sort of close the circle, I feel that we are, as humanity, we are at the point where there needs to be a paradigm shift. We need to be able to shift the paradigm from being identified with ego consciousness predominantly to being identified with this all consciousness in order to solve the problems we're facing today. Because I think it was Einstein who said that you can't solve a problem with the same mindset that created the problem in the first place. So all the problems we have in these 4 dimensions here, the solutions to those problems need to come from quote unquote somewhere else. And that, I think, is what is available to us, but it requires us to unidentify with this and start identifying with that. Yep. With that, I will leave you. I wish you a good week, and I'll see you next time.